Some messages earlier, I just didn't know if it saved. No. I didn't read everything. I don't think there's anything important, though.
Okay. I closed the computer. I didn't realize that would kick.
Yeah, I think they were just letting by or something.
I think we're okay. I think we're on.
Okay, so now back. So maybe let's just start again. We can sit quietly for a couple of minutes. We'll shut the top. Okay, so let's start again. So this morning, I gave just a general introduction to two truths, as you remember, and about sort of mainly why I think it's relevant. I think it's very important to keep that in mind, not just to have an intellectual information, but to see how this is relevant. And then I was going to the Buddhist schools. I went to well, first I went to the non-Buddhist, I went to Samkhya, and then some of them just mentioning briefly about medieval Christianity and then about modern materialism. and then the Vaibhashika, Sautrantrika, and Chittamatra schools in India, Buddhist schools. So I'll talk about the Madhyamaka school. So I've been thinking what I would talk about now. So I think we're here for 2 more hours, looks like. And so I could talk about the Madhyamaka school a bit. And of course, we have the other section of the talk about Bodhicitta and emptiness. So I'll try to talk a bit about that. And then I mentioned I would talk a little bit about some of the evidence that it seems like some of you are interested in about for non-materialism. So I'd also brought a few books that I was going to read some of the passages related to Madhyamaka. But I think I'll put that aside for now, because if I do that, I probably won't have time for everything. So we'll start with just Madhyamaka in general, and then the other parts. And if there's extra time, then I can also read from some of these passages about Madhyamaka. So Madhyamaka, I think I said this morning, Madhya in Sanskrit, it means middle. And then ka means somebody, just like somebody who propounds a particular philosophy, like an adherent to something. Like maybe ist in Tibetan. So ist in English would be the right. So we have like a middleist, a follower of the middle way school, which we generally attribute to Nagarjuna as the founder of the school, who lived, we say, roughly the first half of the first millennium. That's about as precise as we can be about when he actually lived. But maybe if we want to guess, we could say the 2nd century. But it's Indian history is notoriously difficult to date. So the term middle way, it grew out of the Buddha's own statement, as you might know, that he took the middle way between asceticism and hedonism. But this is applying the same idea to a philosophy. So it's the middle way between nihilism and eternalism, I would say. Well, eternalism, I mean, that's an English word. We say dakta in Tibetan, which means like the view of permanence. So it's either over-reifying that something, giving something more ontological status than it ought to have, or denying ontological status. So I mentioned this morning that I think there's one way to see 2 extremes, is that the Chittamatra school, saying that everything that exists is mind, and then the materialist school saying that everything that exists is matter. In the Madhyamaka system, especially the Chandrakirti system, who I'll talk about second, there's 2 different subdivisions here. But in Chandrakirti system, one of his main I said Chandrakirti is an interpreter of Nagarjuna. Right? So Nagarjuna was the founder of this school, and there's different interpreters of his philosophy. Chandrakirti's one of his main points he emphasizes is that we can't say one thing is more real than something else. I mean, of course, we can eliminate things that don't exist at all. You know, we make wrong statements about things, like the proverbial rabbit horn, we say, in Buddhist philosophy, Indian philosophy. There's no such thing as a rabbit's horn. Rabbits don't have horns. So that doesn't exist at all. But among things that do exist, we can't say that one is more real than another, because all of it is just in imputed existence. And I'll explain what that means. When I get to him. So to say that what we call mind is just made up, and that what we call physical matter is a real thing, then that goes to 2 extremes. One of over-reifying the ontological status of physical matter as if it exists somehow beyond our imputation, and then denying something that does exist. Conventionally, mind does exist, even if we can't find it. That would be one way to look at it, those 2 extremes. But usually when they talk about 2 extremes, one is simply the nihilistic view, that basically for them, nihilism could either be taken to mean that you say things don't exist, or in a more specific way, it's essentially the same as the view of materialism. In Indian schools, they consider that the view that mind ceases at death is a nihilistic view. And then the eternalist view, which could either be saying that things are truly existent, or it can also be taken to say that when I die, I continue to exist. They also say that's an extreme view. So we have the Buddha, for example, some of you might know that somebody came and questioned him when the Tathagata, meaning the Buddha, when you pass away, will you continue to exist or will you cease to exist? And he wouldn't answer. And later his student Ananda asked him, why didn't you answer? And he said, well, because either answer would have caused the person to fall into a wrong view. And at least Nagarjuna's understanding of this, because there are different people who understand this in different ways, and some modern Buddhists actually have the view that this was showing that the Buddha didn't believe in reincarnation because he would have said so. But Nagarjuna certainly had the position that this person who was asking the question was assuming that there is some kind of inherent self. So do you ask, if you say, does the inherent self continue to exist or cease to exist? Well, there's no inherent self to begin with. So either way, I'm going to be affirming your implication, which will cause you to fall into a wrong view. Either you think that there's an inherent me that's going to cease to exist, or there's an inherent me that when my body's gone is still going to be there. In either case, you fall into an extreme view. So in India, some of the main commentators on Nagarjuna, we'd say probably the most important ones are Bhava-viveka and then Chandrakirti. And so Bhava-viveka is in Tibetan Buddhism, we call him Svatantrika, even though he didn't have this word for himself. It's a Tibetan invention to divide the Tibetan Bodhicitta schools in this way. But it is a helpful distinction in terms of understanding what he was saying. So Sva, some of you might know the word Swami as a monk, right? In modern India, this is the word they use for a monk. It means like self, one who is in touch with his true self. So Sva means self. And so Swabhava, the nature of something, that things have an inherent nature, that there is something findable within objects or within anything that exists. So Bhava-viveka, he defended Nagarjuna. He was a major commentator on his position of non-true existence. But he was clear that things non-existing doesn't mean they don't exist at all. And therefore you have to talk about some kind of findable thing. So he had the idea that conventional existence, because of course we're here talking about the two truths, conventional existence is something that can be affirmed. There is, when we talk about something that we both talk about in common, so we're going to use the example of the table next to me, we have to be talking about the same thing. Otherwise, we can't have any kind of intelligent conversation about anything. So when we talk about a table, there must be a findable basis of what does it mean to be a table? Something beyond simply my idea and your idea. So in the case of a table, he would say, well, really a table is the collection of the parts of a table. Those constitute a table. And there's the legs and the flat top. Together, that is a table. Otherwise, if you just say that a table is completely non-existent or non-inherently existent, meaning that when you search for it, you can't pinpoint what you mean by a table, then everything falls apart. Then you fall into a nihilistic view, in his opinion. And then within a person, he had the idea that really what a person is mental consciousness. Because the mental consciousness is what migrates from lifetime to lifetime. Otherwise, if we just say that a person is completely non-findable, then where is the room for karma? There's nobody actually going from one life to another, and we can't say I created this karma and I experienced it. So he talks about what he says the conventional mode of abidance of something, which is something that you can find when you search for it. However, when you look beyond that, you find that even that conventional mode of abidance is something that is made up of parts. And therefore, it's not truly existent. If it was truly existent, it wouldn't depend on anything else. So he understands the emptiness as being synonymous with dependent origination. But so Bhavaviveka gives the example of, for example, of the I consciousness. If the I consciousness were truly existent, then it would see in and of itself without depending on anything else. But we understand in Buddhist philosophy that the I consciousness only functions in dependence on the I sense power, we say. We could take the physical I. The I and the I consciousness are two different things. My visual experience of consciousness is something different from my physical I. But that enables the I consciousness to function. If it was truly existent as an I consciousness, then it would have to exist without depending upon the I. And he says, in that case, then your ear consciousness would see, because it also doesn't have to. If something could see without depending on the I, then there's no reason that the I consciousness would see and the ear consciousness would not see in forms. And likewise, he says, he talks about in ancient India we have the idea of the elements. So we have the earth element, and that the earth element is the element of solidity that in things. But if the earth element truly existed, it wouldn't depend upon other factors. And likewise, the water element would be the same way. And therefore, the water element should also be obstructive in the same way as the earth element. Basically, the point is that things don't exist in and of themselves. They only exist in relation to other things, in dependence upon other things, and dependence upon parts. You take them apart, the parts of the table in and of themselves are not the table. They're only a table when you put them all together. But conventionally, those parts of a table together can constitute a table, not truly. So it's only a conventional existence. So then we have Chandrakirti, who's the main philosopher we call in Tibetan, we call it the Prasangika school. Actually, Prasangika is a Sanskrit word, but it was the word Telgyur in Tibetan would translate Prasangika, but there was no word Prasangika in Sanskrit. Nobody called themselves Prasangika, but we sort of back translate it into Sanskrit. So the word prasanga, it means consequence, like a logical consequence. The reason being that there was another philosopher named Buddhicitta who lived just slightly before Bhavaviveka. Actually, I think sort of contemporary with him, but I think he was a little older. And he wrote a commentary on Nagarjuna, on the main text, Root Wisdom, Nagarjuna's main text, where with every verse that Nagarjuna wrote, he would comment on the meaning by forming a consequence, by forming a philosophical consequence. So, for example, when Nagarjuna said, things don't come from self, things are not born from self or other or both or neither, then Buddhicitta's commentary on that, if things were born from self, then they would continuously be born. The consequence is that things would continuously be born forever and ever. Because if I am the cause of myself, then I'll continue causing myself. It's just like a perpetual motion machine. So the consequence is that, and just leaves it at that, without stating what we call a syllogism in English, which in Sanskrit would be called I don't know Sanskrit so well, but sva is the root, right? In Tibetan, it's rangyu. So the Svatantrika of Bhavaviveka system is talking about syllogism. So he kept arguing this way, just using consequences. Now, Bhavaviveka, he then attacked this in his commentary, saying that you're not saying anything. All you're doing is refuting. You're just using consequences to refute somebody else's view. You need to come back and state your own view. At least what we say in the monastery is that Bhavaviveka was a high caste and Bodhicitta was not. So he was afraid to respond because Bhavaviveka has a very high status at Nalanda. He was very well respected. So in his lifetime, Buddhicitta never refuted Bhavaviveka, but later, a couple hundred years later, maybe, yeah, I don't know, we don't know the dates, of course, exactly, maybe generations later, Chandrakirti then came back and defended Buddhipalita and attacked Bhavaviveka, saying that actually you don't need to state. All you need to state is a consequence. In order to bring somebody to the right view, you don't necessarily have to state a syllogism. And more to the point that the Bhavaviveka system is he's assuming that there has to be some kind of common appearing idea to both of our minds. So I talked before about the common appearing that we have a table, we both talk about a table. We have to be talking about a common thing that we can identify. And Chandrakirti says, right there, you've actually accepted what Nagarjuna was trying to negate. You say that you accept that conventionally we can identify a table, but ultimately it depends on other things and therefore is not truly existent. But by conventionally accepting a table, that very thing you've accepted is the exact thing Nagarjuna was saying does not exist when he said things don't truly exist. So you're actually, it's like an oxymoron. You're saying it's conventionally real, but ultimately not findable. You know, it's like saying it's true, but it's false. So this, we said, is the heart of this dispute, making this differentiation. And it's probably, you know, it might make some sense, but I imagine it's hard to get a grasp on exactly the distinction. And this is something, you know, in the monastery, we don't study this until after 11 years. We spend 10 years learning all about the Savadhandrika system and about Dharmakirti system, who I talked about earlier, to really get an idea of what Chandrakirti was pointing out as a fault here, because it's quite subtle. But in Tibet, most Tibetan schools agree with Chandrakirti and say that he had the perfect point right here. It's like Bhavaviveka built himself up as the object to be negated, and showed exactly what we're trying to not grasp at. But Chandrakirti, he gives some very good examples of what are the problems with this. So like if you say, so he doesn't use a table, he talks about a chariot. If you say the parts of a chariot are a chariot, then what about when the parts are all disassembled and lying on the ground? Is that a chariot? So then you might say, well, it's not just the parts, it's the parts arranged in a particular configuration, which might make a little more sense. But then he points out problems with that. And the fundamental problem he points out with that is that you're basically then saying that the configuration of a chariot is a chariot. But to have the idea of a configuration of a chariot, you already have to have the idea of a chariot in your mind. So the configuration is a quality posited on the basis of the chariot. So you can't then come back and say the chariot is something posited on the basis of the configuration of the chariot. So in any case, you cannot pinpoint any particular thing that is the real thing. Conventionally, things exist in terms of our language. We can talk about them and have intelligent conversations. But when we actually try to pinpoint what we're talking about, we can't. And that itself is what we mean when we say it's not truly existent. The parts of a table do not constitute a table. A table has to exist in dependence upon more than just parts. It has to exist upon a labeling, with the basis on a labeling consciousness. Labeling consciousness doesn't say the parts of a table are a table. In colloquial speech, we don't say that. It says we say there's a table over there. We don't say that. You know, for example, when you talk about a person, you know, a person is more complex than a table. You know, we don't say that all of the atoms configured in this particular configuration right now is hungry. We say, I am hungry. So it's as though you're trying to find something real behind your language. You're trying to find that your language actually corresponds to a real thing that exists independently of the way you structure it in your language. He says that itself is the problem. Now, how this relates to some of the things we've been talking about. So, for one thing, I have seen some modern presentations of self as saying exactly this. This is why I talked about the person with the atoms. That there was one philosopher who was pressed to define, who was a materialist philosopher. Well, if there's no mind, there's nothing non-material, what is a person? He said, well, it's a particular configuration of atoms in a particular, or particles in a particular way that constitutes the person. But Chandrakirti would say, well, then you've already assumed that your word person corresponds to a real thing that existed before you came up with the idea of person. Whereas actually there are many things that are not person, that then you, on the basis of that, you come up with an idea of person. But any of those individual things as well, if you go farther, you can also break those down and see that those don't have any existence. So I talked originally about atoms, and I said earlier, this is the attack that Chandrakirti's philosophy would make on materialism, is that there is no such thing as an atom before anyone has an idea of an atom. And it's not as though there are real particles that exist any more than a table exists. They also depend upon things that we can't pinpoint. We say, what is an atom? Well, it's a configuration of an electron and a neutron and a proton in a particular way. But then we have problems with that. So if we have, for one thing, the electron we know now is not something we can pinpoint in any particular way. So for example, one good example we hear is we say, what is a hydrogen nucleus? Right, it's just a proton. So is a proton in a helium atom of hydrogen nucleus? Well, we say it's not anymore, but it's the same thing. It's just a matter of how we conceptually construct something. So we have this idea, and it's useful. It's not that Chandrakirti would never say there's no such thing as an atom in a conventional sense. But when we actually try to pinpoint what we mean by it, we're going to run into all kinds of problems. The same problem we'll run into with the table.
Doesn't there have to be some agreement as to not just the component parts of a table, but the construction of a table?
Yes.
In some cultures, tables might look very different.
Yes.
So you couldn't walk into a carpenter and say, go to the table. There has to be some understanding of what this table is going to look like, its component parts are going to be. So taking that backwards to your original analogy, you couldn't say about a person, build me a Tenzin Gache. Meaning, okay, arms, legs, whatever. But like the table, it has some characteristics, but there are even things that presumably more unique to a human on a table. So I guess what I'm going with this is isn't reality or the conventional reality dependent on common language and common understanding of the thing, whether the thing is a human or a table or lunch, so how real it's still conventional reality, it's not ultimate reality. A person, build me a Tenzin Gache. What would that consist of? It's so my point is that you're no more real than a table that can be deconstructed. Or
right.
Although you are complex in the humans, complex. than the table.
Right.
So I guess to me, that really supports the idea of impermanence. Impermanence is I'm biased towards because it's gotten me through a lot.
Right.
In my life.
Yeah.
This is for.
Yeah.
So well, impermanence.
Yeah, I think. So first of all, your question about a table, like, so I walk into a carpenter from a culture who has a different idea of table. This is one example of showing that it's just a common idea that we hold. So I'm not sure with a table, but one of a good example we can use, we say a pot, because when in Tibetan we use the word bumpa, which we translate into pot in English, it doesn't always correspond to the same thing. So if I walk into a cooking store and I say, sell me a pot, they'll give me a big metal pot for cooking spaghetti. If I was a Tibetan and I said, sell me a bumpa, I would say that's not a bumpa. Because actually in Tibetan, they would not call that a bumpa, right? They have their word bumpa does not entirely correspond with our word pot. So, the Tibetan, if he said, sell me a bumpa and he gives you a cooking pot, he'd say, no, that's not a bumpa, you're wrong. But the question is there a particular right or wrong? Conventionally, yes. If we live in a culture where that's not a pot, then that's not a pot. But there's nothing behind it. It is a matter of what we agree upon.
Yeah. So the apparent reality is something that is accepted uniquely by culture, by country, by definition, by language.
But it's also something that we can't pinpoint. So if I ask you to tell me exactly what it is that is a pot, all right, you could say, well, with the Tibetan, we say it's a round bulbous object with a flat bottom. Well, what if it's not round? What if it's just straight and narrow, like a flower pot? So then we have to make a different definition. So in Bodhicitta system, you have to be able to define something. Actually, you have to be able to have something that we can say when we talk about pot. That's what we mean. Whereas Chandrakirti says conventionally, yes. Like Chandrakirti gives the example of you can't. If the police come and arrest a thief, it's not going to work for him to say, well, I didn't steal anything because there's no money and there's no owner and everything's just a dream. So I'll read it right here. This is one of Chandrakirti's passages. And so it's a Namkyun. So because the world is in all ways not valid, meaning the way we worldly, in common everyday speech, it's not something that's ultimately valid. So therefore, it can't be harmed by the world. So he's saying that he's arguing that people who say that he's talking here about whether things can be. This is one of his central points about things born from other. Because Nagarjuna says things aren't born from themselves, from other, from both, and neither. So the question is, somebody might say, well, things are born from other, right? I'm born from a mother. I'm not born from myself, and that mother is something other than me. So therefore, even our commonly worldly parlance, it harms your philosophy, even if you can philosophically prove things aren't born from other. But Chandrakirti is saying that you're mixing the conventional way of speaking has nothing to do with the ultimate way something exists. But then he says that Jiktandoni Jiktandradniki, so he's saying that the thing in the world is affirmed by worldly renown. And then if you want to dispel that, if you want to refute that, you have to use worldly speech. So also ultimate analysis shouldn't harm worldly things. So this is where in the auto commentary to this, he talks about the thief. And he says that if you say that, well, I didn't steal anything because there's no money at all, it's all just made up. There's a difference between ultimate analysis and then the conventional reality. And we're talking within the framework of conventional reality. So it doesn't mean that things don't exist at all. It doesn't mean that we can't be right. This is the criminal, this is not the criminal, and this is the one who did the crime, and we can arrest him. But when we try to find something that exists outside of our framework of understanding, everything is valid within a particular paradigm, within a particular framework. But when you try to find some kind of real existence behind that, then that's when you have all these problems. That's when you try to define what a table really is. The other philosopher I mentioned, Bodhicitta, he gives a very nice example of there's two men in a temple arguing. There's a picture of a Hindu god, and one says it's Shiva and one says it's Vishnu. And they're arguing and arguing and arguing. And then the temple caretaker comes over and says, "What are you talking about? That's not Vishnu or Shiva, it's a painting." So what he's saying is irrelevant to the argument. But at the same time, it shows that what they're talking about is not a real thing. It only exists within their commonly accepted idea that this is a god here, as opposed to just a painting on the wall. So the problem that Chandrakirti is saying, that all the other philosophers are running into, is that they're trying to find something out of their way of talking about it that actually corresponds to what they're pinpointing.
The example you gave is just like saying that's a black dog and that's a white dog. Remember this morning when we were talking about
Yeah. Horses. But either way, yeah. Okay.
It's still a horse, but one was a white horse and one was a black horse, but it's still a horse. So with the painting, it's a painting regardless of who it's a painting of, and whether it's a white painting or a black painting. So there are levels of specificity of reality.
Mm-hmm.
The conventional reality, not ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm. But the question here is, see, in Dharmakirti's system, what I was talking about this morning, right, that the black horse is a real thing. It exists as a horse beyond my conceptual construct of it. Whereas the painting of Shiva, in order for that to be considered Shiva, it requires somebody having a particular concept of that. I like actually the example of a movie even better, because it's harder to, the painting, at least it's just a visual thing, right? But a movie, when we talk about something on a movie, there's the electron ray hitting the back of the screen, and there's sound. Those are coming from two different channels. I could be listening on my headphones or watching the screen. And I say, now this character is talking. Now this particular person in the movie is talking. But the sound is not coming from the same place as the visual form. It's only in my mind that there is an idea of that happening. Still, conventionally, that's correct. I can make a correct or an incorrect statement about what's happening, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. So it requires a particular person experiencing it in a way, and then coming up with the idea of this is what's happening. Whereas in Dharmakirti's philosophy, it's a little different. That the white horse and the black horse are really horses, but what is the horse that exists that they both are? That's like an idea beyond that. He says that is conceptually constructed, but the black horse itself is not a conceptual construct. So Yeah, you look a little perplexed. I don't, do you mind if I go on, or do you want to say something? So yeah, I didn't want, I said I wasn't going to read that much, but I will read a little bit of Chandrakirti just to give an idea of his philosophy. So this part where I was just reading, where he talks about not birth from other, right? So first he comes up with that even if you say that, well, worldly people say things are born from other, therefore they must be right. He says, well, that has nothing to do with the ultimate level reality of things. When we analyze it, if we can't find birth from other, then we can't say it really exists. But then he goes on to say that actually worldly people don't talk that way. This is a very important point, because it's similar to saying that worldly people don't say this collection of atoms is hungry, as I was saying before. Worldly people don't say things are born from other. And he gives two examples, which it's interesting because this is in Sanskrit. So people talk this way apparently in ancient India. It makes sense in Tibetan, where it's translated, and Tibetans talk this way, and it makes sense in English. So people say, I'm planting a tree. But there's no tree. You're putting a seed in the ground. So the idea is that we don't hold the cause and the effect as two inherently different things. We have the idea that there's just one thing. I'm putting a tree in the ground. I mean, if you actually ask me, no, of course, I'm not putting a tree in the ground. I'm putting a seed in the ground that's going to become a tree. But it's not habitual, it's not instinctively how I talk. And he's saying that that's a very important point to recognize. That because it's beyond the instinct, there's nothing actually findable when we search for it. So we don't have the idea that things come from other. That's only something that comes about when we analyze and try to pinpoint it. But then we have problems. And he says there are all kinds of conceptual problems. If you say that a tree comes from something other, if this seed is an inherently different thing from a tree, the problem is that when does it become a tree? Is it just as like a seed that spontaneously, then there's this tree all of a sudden? It's not like that. Which is what he says, if something came from other, it would have to be like billiard balls, which are two, he doesn't use that word, but he has the same kind of idea. Two different things. You can pinpoint, here's a black ball, here's a white ball, and they collide. That's action of one thing on another. Does the seed act on the tree in that way of creating the tree? But then they have to exist at the same time, right? If a seed created a tree, so if I say I'm baking a cake, right? Here I am rolling dough when I say I'm baking a cake. But where's the cake that I'm working on? The cake doesn't exist until afterwards. So there's no actual action on the cake from the actor. It's only our mind coming up, kind of connecting the dots of what I'm doing. So conventionally, of course, a tree comes from a seed, but that doesn't mean that it comes from something other than it. If you try to philosophically say there are real things that create other real things, that doesn't work. You have all kinds of conceptual problems, first of all. And then secondly, it's not actually how we talk. It's not how our speech functions. The other example he gives is a father and a son. That, a man sees a boy, and he says, I produced that boy. I made him. And not just the words, but the sense of ownership. Whatever he does, I feel proud of it because he's mine. Because all he did was plant a seed. The father didn't do a whole lot of work. It's the mother who actually gave birth to him. But then there's this sense of identification with the product. So as if the product and the cause have some kind of relation that we can't actually find. But it's showing that, in terms of ordinary worldly parlance, we don't talk about causes and effect as if they're two totally separate things. So the reason I chose these passages is because this comes up in the context of him talking about the two truths in his presentation of the two truths, which is one of the most important parts of his text. Saying that, that there are, in his system, when we say what do we mean by conventional truth, what do we mean by ultimate truth? Conventional truth it might sound a little bit like a tautology, but conventional truth is what is pinpointed by conventional analysis. And ultimate truth is what is found by ultimate analysis. But then the question is, what is meant? What do we mean by that, right? So he would basically say that when Bhavaviveka before was talking about finding the conventional mode of abidance of something, the problem is that that's actually ultimate analysis. Ultimate analysis is trying to find out what, how something exists beyond our ordinary way of talking about it. What is behind our words? Versus conventional analysis is simply within that same framework of words. I say, what is a table? We say it's an object, that holds things up, as opposed to it is a collection of these parts. Right? Conventionally, a table is something that holds things up, that I put food on. But ultimately, you're trying to pinpoint, you're trying to search among the bases of designation, I say, among the parts, and pinpoint exactly which ones of those are the thing. And that's conventional analysis. And in Chandrakirti's system, that's ultimate analysis. Ultimate analysis only is able to find emptiness. Mm-hmm. All it finds is that a lack of something. It never is able to actually find something that we can pinpoint that corresponds exactly to the word I use when I say table. So also he talks about conventional. It's interesting, the word conventional, I should have made a mention this earlier. We translate it in English as conventional because it's helpful for us. We usually sort of a colloquial phrase, conventional, like something that we use as a convention in worldly speech. That it doesn't actually have to correspond to anything real, but it's a useful convention. So some of us might agree, well, there are things in the world that are just conventions. Like a marriage. A marriage is just a conventional. You can't find a marriage. Where is a marriage? But it's a useful convention that we can use, and it has effect in the world. You get certain legal rights if you have a marriage that you don't get if you don't have a marriage. But in Chandrakirti's system, all of these things are conventions. It's not, a marriage is no more or less real than a table. But in any case, in his system, in Sanskrit, the word is samvritti, I believe. In Tibetan is kunzol. So that actually, it doesn't have quite the same connotation as in English, the word convention. It has more the sense of being false. Kun means all, and zol means obscure. So all obscuring. Then in Chandrakirti's system, he understands it all as being like manifold. There are many. It's not that. Whereas the ultimate truth is just one thing. There is one final truth. There's only one way that you can find thing that you find is emptiness. Whereas all the manifest things in the world, colors and light and sound and tables and chairs, and so the concealer is talking about the consciousness experiencing it. It's true for a concealer consciousness, a consciousness that does not experience things in the way they are. So if I wear blue sunglasses, then for me the white mountain looks blue. It's not really blue, but it's blue for my eye consciousness because of certain conditions. The blue sunglasses are giving that appearance. So conventionally, for me, that's conventionally real. But it's in the same way, the things that we experience, they're conventionally real based on particular causes and conditions that are causing the consciousness to experiencing things not in the way it actually is. So we experience things, as you said, as permanent. We experience them as having solidity and findability. They appear to exist beyond our particular way of conceiving of them. So it's true for a concealed consciousness or a concealer consciousness, but it's not true under analysis. So for him, Then we have ultimate truth. We said Dön Dam Dempa in Tibetan. I forget in Sanskrit what we said call it. He breaks this down. Dön Dam Dempa. Dön in Tibetan means like meaning. So it's like the final meaning, the thing you find when you search for it. And Dam has the implication of like excellent or superior. So this is talking about the consciousness experiencing it. That is something that exists the way it appears to a being, an Arya being, say in Sanskrit the word noble being, somebody who's had a direct perception of reality through prolonged meditation, has actually accessed things to see the way they really exist, as opposed to the way they exist for concealed consciousness. And then Denpa means in Tibetan it means true. And he said, and Chandrakirti says this has the implication of the way it appears and the way it exists are in accordance. Whereas for conventional truth, that's not the case. It appears one way, it exists another way. So my example of a movie, it appears that this character is talking, whereas actually the sound is coming into the headphone and the visual form is coming from somewhere else. But it appears to me, on my consciousness, that this is what's happening.
What was the scientist? I'm drawing a blank. Was it Newton? Who said that all matter matter does not disappear. It becomes something else. How would that fit into this system where I was wondering how that fits into the idea of impermanence. Because, wood, you chop up the wood, it becomes cinders, you burn it, it becomes ash. There's still matter there. The matter doesn't disappear.
Well, it's sort of what I was talking about earlier with the Madhyamaka system would say that when we talk about matter, if it's conventionally helpful to talk that way, it's good because it helps us to understand it. There's no real thing called matter. This is what I was saying with the mind-body problem, that the whole mind-body problem, the issue is that we assume that when we talk about matter, there's a real thing. So then we have a problem of how does a non-material thing interact with a material thing. Well, the thing, actually, there's no such thing as matter, and there's no such thing as non-matter, ultimately. And so if you conventionally divide the world into that, then you've created a conceptual problem. But you're going to have to find a better way of talking about things if you're going to talk about how mind and matter interact. Otherwise, you're going to have the problem that materialism has fallen into, where you therefore deny the existence of mind because it doesn't fit into your conceptual system. But you're forgetting that your conceptual system is actually a conceptual system. You think that it was already there before you made it, which actually is what happened with classical physics. For many years, they were trying to explain certain things within classical physics, such as we say black body radiation, that didn't make any sense. And ultimately they had decided we have to throw out the whole system because it doesn't actually explain the way things are. There's a quotation from Nagarjuna in his text in Root Wisdom. He says, you gather up the faults you've made and turn them into mine instead, like someone riding on a horse forgets the horse he's riding on. So the point is that this conceptual system of yours is a horse that you're riding on, and you forget that that you're using that crutch to understand things, and you think it's how they actually are. And therefore, then you say there must be this problem because it doesn't work. That mind can't interact with matter. So I said earlier that he negates the Chittamatra system, and I think that same reasoning can be used against the materialism. So here he says, he's talking about the Chittamatra system here, when they negate external objects. Right? I talked about this earlier. In their system, there is no such thing as an external object. Everything is simply an appearance to mind. And Chandrakirti is saying that conventionally there are external objects. You're right that you can't find them ultimately. We agree on that. That does not negate their conventional existence. Something can exist conventionally without being findable ultimately. But you're mixing conventional and ultimate reality here. Because when we talk about external objects, we're not talking about a real thing that exists inherently independent of mind. We're just talking about conventionalities of the world. Right? So if we want to negate conventional objects, we have to use worldly analysis. So it's true, I can negate something through worldly analysis. If this person is wrongly accused of a crime, I can use very subtle analysis. I can be a forensic investigator and use all kinds of analysis to prove that he didn't commit the crime. That is very different from denying the existence of something. Right? I can't prove the non-existence. I can't prove the non-existence of external things using conventional analysis. I'd have to resort to ultimate analysis. And Chandrakirti says, I agree with you, it doesn't exist ultimately, but neither does the mind. The exact same analysis can be pinpointed to negate the mind, as can be used to negate external objects. So you can't say there is inner and there's no outer. And he also says that the whole point of inner and outer is dependent on each other. So you can't say there's inner, but there's no outer world. But you could just say there's outer world, but there's no inner world. You have the same problem. There's only an inner world in relation to an outer world. They only exist in relation to each other. So he says, if it was the case that the world did not harm you, meaning that worldly parlance did not harm what you're talking about, he says, then go ahead and negate the world and argue with the world. And he says, so you and the world fight it out, and I'll follow the stronger party. So the same analysis can be used when I talk about the materialism, and I talked about my teacher Dennett saying that there is no mind. He's come to the conclusion that mind, when people talk about mind, they're mistaken. That ordinary worldly parlance, talking about the mind, is mistaken because we can't actually locate anything that corresponds to that. However, ordinary worldly parlance, talking about atoms and molecules, that's true, because those are real. But the question has to be, why do you give more status to one than the other? So what time is it? Yeah, so I could read quite a bit more from Chandrakirti. I wanted to read especially from a text 60 stanzas by Nagarjuna, which is a very nice text of his. That I also translated it, so I have in English where I was trying with Chandrakirti, I was having to translate it on the spot here. And then also Shantideva, his text, he has quite a lot in his 9th chapter on his text.
The way of the Bodhisattva.
Yeah, exactly. The 9th chapter is all about wisdom. And so he talks about conventional ultimate truth, which if we have time, maybe I can do, but I did want to talk about some of the other things that we had on the list. So let's see. But as I said at the beginning, these two subjects, first the two truths, and then how bodhicitta and emptiness support each other, are related. So now I'll talk more about bodhicitta and emptiness, how they support each other. So I think, most of you have some background, but just very briefly, we say bodhicitta, the word chitta is mind and bodhi is awakening. So it's the mind that wishes to be enlightened. It's for Buddha. So mind here is understood because in Buddhist philosophy, mind is not like we sometimes say in English, like as though I have my mind. In Buddhist philosophy, it's like you can have many minds. I have the mind of anger, the mind of compassion. I have the mind of that sees things, my eye consciousness. These are all minds. So I have many particularities. So the wish to be enlightened, essentially, we can translate it that way very loosely. So this is something we want to cultivate in Mahayana Buddhism, is the wish to be enlightened. And we want, especially, has to be based on compassion. It said, Shantideva actually talks about this, not in Way of the Bodhisattva, but his other text, which is called Compendium of Training.
I didn't know you'd written anything.
Yeah. Well, actually, it's a compendium because it's just a sort of collection of sutras. He collects a bunch of sutra quotes and gives a short introduction. This is what these are about. So he says that there's many different reasons you might wish to be enlightened. So, for example, you might see the Buddha and say, wow, that guy looks amazing. I want to be like him. But he says that's not really bodhicitta. It's not just about, wanting to be cool like that other person. Yeah.
I've heard Bodhicitta translated as awakened heart.
Yeah, I mean, that's a nice way. And also in Sanskrit, chitta, right? So the distinction between a heart and mind that we make in English, they don't have quite so strongly, right? Like especially the word tuk in Tibetan, we have many words for mind in Tibetan, but the word chitta translated as sem. But in Tibetan, we also have the honorific language. So tuk is the honorific for that. And it can also mean heart. The same word means heart and mind. So they don't obviously have the conception also of the brain, which is something that in some sense we have an advantage. I mean, ancient Indians, they did not, it would seem, know a whole lot about the functions of the brain. But I think the extreme is to then to conflate that the mind is the same thing as the brain. So they wouldn't say that the mind is here in the head. They would think more of the mind's in the heart. This is your wish, your true wish. So Shantideva says that one possibility is that you see the Buddha and think this is amazing. I want to be like that. Or you might think that the Buddhist teachings are dying out, and therefore I would like to preserve them. So I want to achieve that state. He says that's a little bit closer, but that's still not fully bodhicitta. And he says it has to really come from compassion. It has to be a wish that you want to benefit all sentient beings and recognize that the best way to do that is to be enlightened, and therefore wish to achieve the state of a Buddha for that reason. If you don't have that, it's not going to lead you there. Otherwise, it can become kind of a selfish thing or just a mistaken pursuit. But then once you have that mind, this wish to be enlightened, really once starting with compassion. So you look at all the suffering in the world and you think, this is really awful. I want to do something about this. So the question is, what do you do about it? So many people would have different answers. I sometimes like to give the example. It might sound a little out of place, but it's actually, I think it's quite useful to think about, of Che Guevara, who it seems, I wouldn't say that he had great compassion. I'm reading a little bit about some things of his life, but at the same time, he really did have a sincere wish to benefit the world. And he thought that the best way to do this was through violent revolution and through communism, essentially making many countries communist. And he really believed very sincerely that if he could do this, it would benefit a lot of suffering people in the world. So that is one idea. That's one idea that somebody has about what's the best way to make things better. And that might be a little more extreme than most people, but a lot of people have the idea that politically we can change the political system and that will help the world. And it's not to say that there is not benefit in that. I think, having grown up in this country, although there's a lot of dark spots in our history, I agree with the idea that our ideas of democracy and liberty have been very beneficial, not just for our country, but other countries have copied that example. And I don't take for granted that I had the opportunity to practice Buddhism because I grew up in a country that allowed me to practice whatever religion I wanted. So it definitely is not the case that there's only one solution. But taken to the extreme, which like it also would seem, not just Che Guevara, but for example, Karl Marx had an idea that if we change the political system, basically all the world's problems are going to go away. And whether we support communism or not, because I think it's a valid viewpoint if people have that. But certainly Buddhist philosophy would not agree that simply bringing a new political system is going to solve the problem. The idea is that the ultimate problem is in people's minds. As long as people's minds have delusions, then no matter what the political system might be, no matter what the no matter what the social system might be, although it might be of some help, it's not until people's minds change that won't be there won't be an ultimate solution. So the idea here is when we have that, we think, well, okay, that's the next step. If I want to change everybody else's mind. But then how do I achieve that? So here I'll bring in what Tsongkhapa talks, but I want to ask, because I wondered if something I said was difficult, and I would be happy to engage in discussion on it.
Well, I didn't get into a discussion.
That's okay.
But it seems to me that many dictators have used that excuse. My system, their deluded minds, their system is going to benefit others and make for a better world.
Okay.
And they're not reading Shantideva. Because Shantideva, in the way that lays out very clearly, how you were going to it's not by study, it's now given like style. So it's it's just frustrating to me because politicians have a way of distorting. I'm going to say something that's very fun.
Okay.
Politicians have a way of distorting reality. We can all think of some politicians that are distort reality and say that they're doing this for the government, society, and so you can use this kind of argument to justify your own. Maybe Mao really did think that by starting everybody, he was going to make for a better world. I don't know. Whether Stalin really thought that either when he started all the agreements. But my point is just you can use this argument, you can distort it and twist it to suit your own need, your goals, your own goals.
Yes. Yeah, I think you basically answered the question and here what I'm trying to point out, that it needs more than just a wish to benefit. You also need a lot of wisdom. And wisdom requires knowing when your own thought is a delusion, being able to recognize your own mistaken conceptions about things.
That's why it has to be
Right. Yeah.
And that's what Shantideva points out in many of his verses.
Yes, absolutely. So, what Tsongkhapa says, I don't know, some of you might have read the Lamrim General, is that even if you have the wish to benefit all sentient beings, if you don't train yourself in faith in the possibility of achieving enlightenment and wish to achieve the state of Buddhahood, then you can't develop bodhicitta. So it's not just a matter of having compassion, although compassion is an essential component. And this is something that sometimes could get overlooked, because it's important to recognize his language. He doesn't say if you don't believe in being a Buddha. He says you have to really train your mind. This is our approach in the Gelug school, is to argue about things, to examine them very closely. So it's not just enough to think, so the first example of Shantideva, I want to be like that. Well, it's not enough to go to a teaching of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and say, wow, he's amazing, I want to be like that. And I believe in enlightenment because he seems like he's enlightened. That might work for a little while, but eventually you might start having doubts about that. And that's why it's really important to examine, is there such a thing as enlightenment? Sometimes as Buddhists, we might try to take that for granted. We talk about it in our speech. I'm on the way to enlightenment. It's not necessarily bad to have that if it helps you to feel more, more enthusiasm about what you're doing and not get discouraged. But sometimes it's also very useful to ask, do I really have any reason to believe this? Is there any, have I, since I encountered Buddhism, because say before I became a Buddhist, I didn't believe in enlightenment, I didn't know anything about it. Has there been any real change in my understanding of reality that now allows for the possibility of being omniscient, which is a pretty big jump, right? So this is where emptiness comes in. This is why I wanted to bring this in. That in Madhyamaka philosophy, emptiness goes hand in hand with understanding what it means to be a Buddha. What does it mean to be enlightened? How do you get there? So I'll start actually by talking about Dharmakirti again. Talked about him this morning, who's not a Madhyamaka philosopher, but had the most systematic presentation of any Indian philosopher of trying to prove that it's possible to become Buddha. And so it's interesting because a lot of the arguments he makes probably might be a little outdated now. There might be things that we could find that that say that this particular argument is not really effective against some things we know. But there are certain, the heart of his argument, the way that, first of all, the fact that he even tries to make this argument, I think is very useful because we can try to make the same argument just using more data that we might have available that was not available then. And think about how can we come up with an idea of what enlightenment is. But also some of the basic points he makes are very valid and very relevant. So it's interesting, the very first point he makes, because he starts out with an argument, as these texts often do, some opponent presenting an argument. He says, this is a Buddha, this is why we want to achieve Buddhahood. And somebody says, well, you can't achieve Buddhahood because there's no way to get there. Basically the first argument is because the mind is dependent on the body, then when the body dies, then the mind will cease. So therefore, there's no way to develop these qualities infinitely. You can only develop them to a certain point until you die, but then there's not going to be anything more. So his first major section in this argument is to try to prove reincarnation. So that's something that's very relevant for us. And that's why I say some of the points, because it doesn't seem like he's really, there's the question about the brain. Is the brain responsible for mind? And he doesn't really address that. But it's interesting. The translator of this chapter, it's the second chapter of his text, Pramanapartika. Roger Jackson, a professor at I think it was at Carleton College. Yeah. He translated this into English, but it's sort of I found myself laughing a bit because it's clear, it's very good as a translator. He has the right attitude that he is not just accepting this. He is actually really interested in going with these arguments and trying to see where they lead. But he keeps putting in these footnotes. It's like, well, actually, he says this, but I wonder, maybe would this argument fly in the face of modern neuroscience? But he has quite a valid point there with some of these things. Like Chantakirti, Dharmakirti, some of his arguments are like, so if Right, so if you sever if you have a piece of wood and you char it, you burn it, right? It doesn't ever regenerate. Whereas the mind is different than that, right? The mind has the quality that, or also the body, even uses the example of the body, that if you get sick, but still you can recover. And that make a full recovery. So there must be some element going on in the body that is not there in a dead piece of wood. So this actually would probably be called vitalism today, which is something that most biologists think is wrong. That actually we can explain why the body regenerates, a live body, and a corpse doesn't degenerate. We don't have to bring in some element. There's this life force in there. We can just talk about the way that living cells function together coherently, whereas dead cells don't do that. So that's a valid point, but it's interesting that he's using these arguments. It's just because these are still arguments that people make today. And as I use the term vitalism, there are people who argue for vitalism. There are still people who argue against biology, the generally reductionist biology, where there is no such thing. There's no ingredient in life other than molecules forming into cells that form into, or forming into proteins that form into cells that form into living beings. So these are the arguments he's using that are still being argued today. So it's very useful to look at, if you have time to look through that. But the main point is here, he's trying to prove, is there such a thing as reincarnation? So the point here is that if we really want to talk about enlightenment, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we don't accept reincarnation.
Yeah. There you go. For your dog as previously can. This argues for reincarnation.
So the thrust of his argument is about, if there is no reincarnation, where does mind come from? And he argues that mind cannot arise from material causes. So this is very relevant still today. But as I said, the argument of a lot of philosophers, and headed by Dennett here, is that there is no such thing as mind. Right? We basically have to deny the existence of mind because we can't explain it by in any material way. And even if we could explain it, we can't explain how it interacts with any kind of material thing, so that it becomes irrelevant, or say epiphenomenon, meaning something that that doesn't have any actual interaction with the rest of reality. But then how does it exist at all? What does it mean to exist? But for Dharmakirti, this proves quite the opposite. It proves that there is a thing that is non-material. There is a non-material mind. He says that, and there's somebody comes up with the argument against him that, well, we could say that there is mind that exists in everything. It just exists in all matter, has this particular quality of like mentalism that then combines to form gross material minds, or gross minds, when they're, the atoms are arranged the right way, which is, I think, quite similar. There's a modern philosophy called panpsychism, which is it's not accepted by most materialist philosophers, but there are philosophers who consider themselves materialists who still accept this. They'll say that it's not that there's like some kind of mind that comes in fully at the time of conception, like what Buddhists might say, but that all physical things just have this quality of them, that somehow when it's arranged a particular way, it functions as mind. It's some kind of other quality in physical matter. So the way Dharmakirti argues against this is he brings in the Samkhya view. So I mentioned Samkhya earlier, who believe that causes exist, or results exist in the cause. And so he says, because the argument against that, one of the arguments against that is that, so this might seem like a strange idea, but they would say, for example, if there is an elephant fetus that looks nothing like an elephant, why does it develop into an elephant? There must be something in the fetus that causes it to develop into this particular form. So the result must exist in the cause in a non-manifest way. But the argument that's made against that, okay, well, how far back do you trace the line of causation? So if the elephant exists already in the elephant fetus, well, it must also exist in the elephant sperm. And it must also exist in the grass that the elephant is eating to nourish itself that will then reproduce a new elephant. So you're saying there's an elephant on the grass, and then you're saying, well, there's hundreds of generations of elephants, so there must be 100 elephants on this blade of grass. So Chandrakirti, he brings this argument in, and he says that, look, the Samkhyas say this. This is how they talk in ancient India, but basically they're fools. You want to sound like them? You want to be a Samkhya and talk about 100 elephants on a blade of grass?
Yeah.
So likewise, you want to talk about that mind exists on the physical atoms? Well, where? How does it exist in that way? So he says this is a ridiculous view. But it's still, as I say, this is actually a view that is held by some people today, and it's worth considering. Is there some kind of other ingredient? So is it that mind? It's not something totally different than material, but it's so far unfound ingredient within physical things that allows for the manifestation of mind in complex physical interactions. But again, Dharmakirti argues against this, and again comes to the conclusion it must come from a non-material thing. He says that a substantial cause, and like for example, the substantial cause is different from the cooperative condition. So if I want to build a pot of clay, I need clay. The person who makes the pot is the condition that's a cooperative condition. But without clay, I can't make a clay pot, no matter how skilled of a pot maker I am. So likewise, the substantial condition has to be there. The physical body is just a cooperative condition that allows a human mind to manifest, but the substantial cause has to be mind. Mind only comes from a similar substantial cause. You can't make clay out of metal. So likewise, mind has to be made out of elements of mind. So the physical body acts as a catalyst for that to manifest, but there has to be the substantial cause of a mind before that.
And mind has neuroplasticity, so mind can change, which is one of the things that happens with meditation. There have been numerous studies now with monks hooked up to the lectures that over a period of time demonstrate how mind has changed, presumably because these are monks who've meditated thousands of hours. I'm sure you've seen these.
Yeah. But I would just point out, neuroplasticity means the brain is changing. It doesn't necessarily mean the mind is changing or not changing.
But what's creating the cause for that?
Well, that's a different question, right? But a lot, still materialist scientists would still say that, of course, the brain can change. There doesn't mean there's a non-material mind.
So in
but
that regard, you're making a distinction between the mind and the brain.
Well, as I said, certainly here in Dharmakirti's philosophy, they're two different things, not the same thing. The mind is the cooperative condition.
Why wouldn't it be a characteristic of mind that is manifesting within this capacities of cellular plasticity?
Neuroplasticity.
That's how I always thought of it as.
Well, what does that mean then? So are you saying, so I guess I'll ask a very specific question. Are you saying that the cells are the same as the mind, or are you saying that they're the cause of the mind? That's a very different thing.
I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. I feel like I feel
Okay.
it's not speaking the language that we're learning today. Mind as in I just want to like characteristic of manifestation of mind in form. And plasticity is something we're just starting to be able to measure
Mhm.
using present scientific means.
Mhm.
Let's give yourself another 25 minutes. I want to, but it's
Yeah.
not, I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
being honest there.
Yeah.
But what you're speaking of, yeah, that's not.
That's okay. So yeah, I mean, but I just want to point out, because we have to be very careful. You know, it's sometimes the assumption is that this we've seen this in many modern presentations, that if we can find some kind of neural correlate, so we can pinpoint when people are sad, there's this particular appearance on an EEG or an fMRI. Does that mean that that appearance, that physical correlation is sadness? Right? Or are you saying it causes sadness? But there doesn't ever seem, but oftentimes there does not seem to be an attempt to explain that. It's just, well, we found it. We found sadness. Well, so when somebody frowns, they're sad. Is that shape of the lips sadness? Right? Just because something correlates to something else doesn't mean it's the same thing. And you have to explain there's some relation. Is it causal? And which one is causing the other? Maybe the sadness is causing that particular correlation in the brain as opposed to the other way around. You haven't proved that that is the same thing, or that you've thereby reduced sadness to a brain state. Right.
But the plasticity itself, like even the capacity for something to change, the conditions that create, or I'm not willing to let go of plasticity. And
I'm certainly not rejecting plasticity, but I'm not even necessarily saying that the mind is not the brain, but I'm saying that plasticity is a brain function. It does not by any means necessarily have to say something about the mind. It definitely shows when the brain changes, there are changes in the mind, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're the same thing.
So what is meditation working on?
You mean, is it working on
your brain or your mind?
Well, so in obviously in Indian philosophy, they didn't really talk much about the brain. And she's right. Nowadays, there have been studies of long-term meditators. One of the best is of Mingyur Rinpoche, of what happened to his brain after many years of meditation. But there's several possibilities of what happened. One would be that his brain is his mind, and therefore by meditating, he's just moving his mind and moving his brain. One would be that the reason his mind has changed is because his brain has changed. One would be that because his mind has changed, that has affected his brain. Right? All of those could be valid. It was actually the philosopher William James, 100-something years ago, who said this quite succinctly. He said that we have a lot of data now. This was 120 years ago. They had a lot more data now. But then he said 1900 basically. We have a lot of data about the correlation between the mind and the brain. It is perfectly, it would fit perfectly with three distinct possibilities. Any of them could be true. One is that the mind is the same thing as the brain. And I forget the example he used there. He said one is that the mind causes the brain causes the mind in the way that a crossbow fires an arrow. One could be that the brain affects the quality of the mind in the way that a prism affects the quality of light, but the light is shining from somewhere else into the prism and then reflected as a rainbow. There's no rainbow without the prism, but the prism is not the rainbow. The rainbow is mainly the substantial cause, it's the light shining. And he tended towards that latter position. James was a non-materialist philosopher, even though philosophers like Dennett consider him as to be their hero, intellectual hero, but most of them kind of write off his non-materialist view. But the point is that, there's something happening. There's some correlation happening. But what exactly that is, and then she mentions about Mingyur Rinpoche. I assume you're talking about Richard Davidson and Daniel Goleman's presentation, right? So they're very honest. And Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson say by studying Ringa Rinpoche, we've found data that by all means, it does not fit into any current scientific paradigm. We have no way to explain what it means. We don't know what it is, which is a good answer. If you don't know,
Right.
it's better to admit that. It's clear that after many years of meditation, there are gamma waves occurring in his brain at amplitudes that are like 900% of what's considered maximum. So what does that even mean? What is a gamma wave, and what does it to do with the mind? We know a few things, such as in terms of correlation, and that when people have gamma waves, they tend to be more creative. So when they have a burst of gamma activity for 5 seconds, they tend to be creative. What if somebody has 900% of that for hours at a time? Well, I don't know what that means, but they say it's unusual. It's worth examining. But then to jump to the conclusion that creativity is gamma waves. Well, what does that even mean? So do gamma waves paint paintings? I don't think so. So there's some, we have to be very clear what we mean by creativity if we're going to say creativity is the same thing as the gamma wave.
Yeah. But isn't change, so, I mean, just to bring it to a very kind of conventional, worldly, functional level, when we talk about neuroplasticity, it has labels.
Yeah.
We talk about cultivating habits of mind, cultivating, you know, the different things that you spend an inordinate amount of time doing, and that there's ways that are showing that that's could very likely is being reflected in neural pathways changing when you do
Absolutely.
certain things.
I mean, my feeling on it, from what I've read, and it's like say a working hypothesis, is that mind, if it's not a material thing, it still creates pathways in the brain. Therefore, they become habitual. It becomes a lot easier for it to, if we think of mind as a kind of energy, that it's much easier for it to flow that direction because it's already created those pathways. It doesn't mean the pathways are the same thing, but it like, and the Buddhist philosophy doesn't talk about the brain, but it does talk about the sense powers, right? So the eye is not the same as the physical eye is not the same as the eye consciousness. But if you damage the eye, then the eye consciousness will not be able to function very well. So the mind, the human mind in this life is definitely very dependent upon the brain for proper functioning. One example I'll use, because I will get to.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
The
brain is dependent. Well, we say that the brain, yeah, it is affected by the mind, right? It's not. I mean, the brain functioning. It's sort of the brain is like almost like James's example. Like it's something that kind of channels the mind. This would be one way to think of it. So I should get before too long. I will talk more about the evidence anyway, but one that I'll bring up here that I think is relevant is what's called terminal lucidity. Have you ever heard of this?
Terminal
Lucidity.
Oh.
So
sounds like a
yeah.
great band.
So when people's brains deteriorate through Alzheimer's, it is undeniable that the mind deteriorates along with that, from what we can observe. This is one argument. There was a philosopher named Paul Edwards, who was one of the few philosophers, and I give him credit for this, who actually tried to argue against reincarnation, because most philosophers just ignore it. But he at least took the time to argue against it. And one of his arguments was that, look, it's very clear that the mind is dependent on the brain, because when the brain deteriorates, the mind deteriorates with it. So it would be crazy to think that when the brain just stops functioning, the mind makes a complete recovery and goes on to another life. But it's interesting he says that, because that actually sometimes appears to happen. So sometimes in the case of Alzheimer's patients or other dementia patients, at terminal lucidity, so at the moment of death, or maybe an hour before they die, they'll suddenly regain lucidity. And so one theory that some non-materialist scientists have of what's happening is that the mind in this life is very connected with the brain. At death, it is separating from the brain. when it's no longer so connected with the brain, it's not so dependent on something that is, that is not functioning. We saw this happen actually. It was interesting. Just a couple of nights ago, I was talking with some couple people in Creston, one monk and one laywoman, and they were sharing their stories of this happening. And I didn't want to. They were talking a lot. I didn't want to interrupt them, but I remembered also a story. This happened in the monastery. There was a monk who, when I first got there, he was already quite advanced dementia. I met him a few times, and the only thing he ever said, he'd say, "I'm 62," which was definitely not true. He's probably 85. And then what did he say? He said, "My knee hurts." He kept pointing to his knee and saying, "My knee, it's really, really bothering me." And then he was the only Tibetan person I ever heard who said, "The Chinese are no good." Most of them don't say that, but I guess, he's getting senile, so he was pretty more honest. Yeah. By the end, he got worse and worse. He started violently hitting people. He hit me several times. One time I met him on the road, and he asked me to bring him, because Samdharma Rinpoche was teaching, so I kind of walked him along the road, and then he started hitting me on the head with his cup. And he got worse and worse and worse, and then about a month before he died, we could hear him. He was just a couple blocks down from us. He was like screaming all day and beating his attendant, I heard. And then about a week before he died, he suddenly became very peaceful. And he called his attendant over and he said, "I want to thank you for taking care of me all these years. But now it's time for me to go. I'm going to die soon." And they called in a doctor who said, "No, he's not going to die. He's perfectly fine. I mean, he's old, but there's nothing wrong with him. But he's about imminently going to die." And then one day when his attendant was out somewhere, he called another monk in and said, "Okay, I'm going to go." So they held up a picture of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and he saw it. He started crying, and then he just died. And then when he died, it appeared that he stayed in some kind of tukdam for about 3 days. Sometimes happens in the monastery. But that is one example. That would be called terminal lucidity, that the person suddenly seems to regain their recognition of their relatives and of the other people. So that would, so your question was about the relation between the mind and the brain here, and that there is, in this lifetime, the mind is very dependent on the brain for functioning, at least in ordinary experience. Right. So the question is, there might be people who meditate very deeply who can go beyond that, who aren't so dependent on that. But if for ordinary people who are used to being in waking consciousness, then their everyday experience is very much dependent on the functioning of the brain. I want to continue with Dharmakirti here, and then I'll come back, because it does seem like people are quite interested in this topic about this evidence. But that is one, a terminal lucidity, which, it's basically, there's a saying, I forget how it's phrased, but it's like, if something doesn't really fit into the current scientific paradigm, then it tends to get ignored. So there's a lot of evidence, but there's nobody collecting it because no one knows what to do with it. But anecdotally, there are a lot of people who report this. And as I said just a couple nights ago, I heard these two people were sharing. One was of her father, who just before death, he had been demented for many years, and then he just recognized everyone, said goodbye to them. And somebody else who was talking about a woman, I think, who had Kuru, this degenerative brain disease. It's like the mad cow disease that it's just not the same thing, but it's a similar thing that human beings get, and that what had happened right before the time she died. Okay, so Dharmakirti, he says, first of all, we have to establish reincarnation. After he goes through a long argument on this, then the counter argument is, okay, there's this mind that goes from life to life, but it doesn't mean that it can just be developed infinitely. It could be limited. Because for two reasons. It could be that it doesn't have the quality of sort of of supporting itself. And the counterexample here is jumping. So I can train myself to jump, and I can jump higher and higher, but there is a particular limit. I can't train myself to jump 500 feet in the air, no matter how much I train. The problem is that every time I jump, I fall back to the ground. It's not like I can jump and then I'm at 5 feet, then I can jump to 10 feet. So there's a particular limit. So likewise, the mind is probably the same way, that you can train in compassion, but there's some reason that the basis is limiting it. And likewise, it could be that the more you train in something, it actually destroys itself. It actually, in the sense that if you have water, if you keep heating water, you can't heat water to 1,000 degrees because it will evaporate. Likewise, if you keep pushing the mind more and more, it doesn't have the ability to support itself. It will actually kind of break down at a certain point. So he says these are the two counterexamples, and he gives reasons why he says mind is different than that. And he says, yeah, okay, with the mind, it's not like the example of jumping, and we can see that through observation. If somebody practices compassion for a long time, then that just becomes their natural state. Somebody who's practiced compassion for 10 years very sincerely is a lot more compassionate today than they were 10 years ago, even when they're not meditating. Whereas somebody who's been jumping for 10 years just hover in the midair most of the day, right?
It's gonna have really bad knees.
Right, yeah. So the point being that when you train the mind, it gets to a certain point, and that becomes the base level. Then you can work up from that. So it is as though you could jump to 5 feet and then start from there and jump to 10 feet. You can get to the point where that is your base level. Then you push yourself a little more, and it goes a little more. So, and then likewise with the example of the water, he said, you just mentioned this. The mind is clear and knowing. He says that the nature of mind is not like a physical phenomenon. There's some kind of basis of mind that just allows it to continue. There's this mere clear and knowing. It doesn't depend on spatial relations and temporal relations in the same way as physical matter does. And so the more you train your mind, the more compassionate you become. The mind can become anything.
Well, that's,
Yeah.
with a little bit of wisdom, isn't that what gets you to enlightenment? Is that ultimate combination of compassion and wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So when you say, okay, you get more and more and more compassionate, what's the point? Where does that get you? Well, that's what gets you to enlightenment.
Yes.
It's not adding on.
Well, that's another thing. It's getting rid of certain negative phenomena.
That's the wisdom.
Like you see the mind's clear and aware,
Mm-hmm.
that's its natural state that's immeasurable.
Mm-hmm.
So take the brain and turn it on its head, right? Like we're not putting on, we're taking away, and we're getting more and more in touch with this natural state.
Mm-hmm.
So when you test people like the car, or, when you order a shade, perhaps they've just been shedding very many advantageous states.
Yeah, and that's
the biological, here is biological brain or
yeah. I mean, there are different ways to present it, right? So there's some schools of thought that enlightenment is like that you keep kind of adding on the positive qualities, whereas the other is that there's some sort of natural state. And different schools of thought conceive of that in different ways, right? So
I would imagine good, but
yeah,
from a third turning, especially quoting number 15, this the mind's clear and aware, and you start with that definition, you go out and test it. So there's actually no argument on the other side, right? Like, yeah, the brain deteriorates, the body deteriorates, but there's something, space, Buddha, mind. And meditation is just the familiarization of that state. And it's changed with your question, right? Like, not from self, not from other, not from both, not from either, does anything ever arise? Like it either becomes energy or matter, it causes conditions, then how do we best, that was sort of the postulation, like, how do we best get in touch with this bodhicitta that is so natural, so right here, but we can't utilize it, how, and that's why I'm here, I apologize for running late, but
Okay,
it's a wonderful presentation, thank you.
thank you for coming.
But isn't that, you know, as Heather asked, half an hour ago, how does meditation, where does meditation come in? How does it help? Well, that's sort of the answer to the question, if it's a question. How do we get there? How do we develop more compassion? Not as necessarily as an add-on. Actually, compassion may be something that comes with letting go of more and more of self. There's the self-craving, self-attraction, all of that. And so that's how we get there, is meditation. But it's one of the ways to get there.
Familiar, all
Awareness.
of which is scientific.
Yeah, and that's what happens with meditation.
No,
So after these two steps, so Dhammakirti says we establish that there is reincarnation. And not only, so therefore the mind can develop over a period of many lifetimes as opposed to just one. And furthermore, that it's not limited in the same way that jumping or water is limited. But then another counter argument could be, you know, although you can develop it in this particular way, is there actually, you know, what if, for example, what if the apprehension of a self, which at least it is for the sake of argument, the opponent is agreeing, okay, we see the apprehension of self, that is the cause of suffering. We can see how people who have a strong sense of me and I and what I want, they suffer a lot more. They get angry at others who obstruct them and they always feel they don't have what they need. What if that's correct? If that's a correct consciousness, then you can't get rid of it. It itself will only develop strong more and more, and that could just become infinite, and actually destroy any potential for enlightenment. So why does it have to be that this potential for enlightenment goes the other way? So then he goes into a long argument trying to prove that both selflessness and also in general the Four Noble Truths are correct. So that in of itself is worth going over. I don't have time now, but this is where it kind of diverges a bit from Madhyamaka. And this is where the Madhyamaka philosophy comes in, just in as much as their idea of what they're negating is a little different. So you could almost like tag it on here. You could use Dhammakirti's philosophy up to a point, and then use the Madhyamaka philosophy to try to show that this apprehension of true existence that we have is incorrect. And therefore, there must be a counter consciousness that is apprehending things as they actually are. And then using this reasoning of you can develop that infinitely to a point where there is no more even an instinctual sense of true existence. That can be eliminated through cultivation. Now, how does that make you omniscient is the question. No, that's again maybe a bit of a jump. So the understanding is that we call cognitive obscurations. That the reason a mind is unable to access things is because something is obscuring it. And so there has to be some way to eliminate those. That those obscurations, they must come from a particular cause. And essentially it's coming, according to this philosophy, from dualistic conceptions of things. Dividing things into this and that, so that's that the mind only experiences a limited piece of things, as opposed to things in their totality. So that is something that comes from imprints of having conceived of things as truly existent. So there's this long progression in meditation. Now, I've quite oversimplified it. You know, I think I would be disappointed if you were convinced just by that there is omniscience. But this is to give you an idea that this is the kind of meditation that is done. We say, how does emptiness and bodhicitta, how do they support each other? That emptiness gives us the ability to start to comprehend that there could be some state of mind that is beyond our ordinary experience, the state of mind of enlightenment. Otherwise, just having compassion isn't enough. If we don't really have faith that, that there is such a thing as enlightenment that we can achieve, then we may as well, take some other means. I don't know, political action or something else, but something more concrete rather than trying all this time meditating in a cave, trying to get enlightened, if there's no such thing as enlightenment. So I have a few other things I could say on that. But yeah, I mean, there's no limit to how far we can go on, and I said there were other things I could read from. But I do want to present a little bit about evidence, as I was talking about, which relates to this, but talking about past and future lives, and so forth, and about non-material mind, and then also have some time for question and answer. So just a sort of a brief recitation of it. As I said, for quite a number of years now, I've begun gathering things that I find relevant in this context. So there could be many possibilities. We could say philosophically, that mind could be the same as the brain, and it could be a separate phenomenon. But that doesn't necessarily prove reincarnation. It could be that some people have the idea that there's like this sort of ethereal stuff of mind, and that is not that's not coming from the physical matter, but then that incarnates into a being. Why does it not just dissolve back into the great cloud of mind? Why would it incarnate as a particular being? Which is a good question. But with anything, if we have particular evidence, we have to ask, well, does this paradigm, what does this way of understanding explain all of the evidence in the best way? That's usually the scientific presentation. Is ideally not only something that can explain it, but make predictions. That is the best test of a theory, is that it can make accurate predictions, that then we do this experiment and we get this result, which is quite hard. There's a few things on the more basic level that have been done with that. But those are things to look into. So the evidence I'll present, I think, first of all, is not compatible if it's correct with a materialist standpoint, which is why usually the materialist argument against it is to argue that it's fraudulent. That's really the only way to argue against it. Which I think, coming back to our original talk about scientific views, I think is a non-scientific way of going about things. Every time you have evidence that challenges your theory, if you consider it fraudulent, that's really just dismissive. It's not science at all. Unless you can show that it's fraudulent, or show some reason to believe that it's fraudulent beyond that it doesn't fit in my theory.
Fake news.
Fake news, yeah.
It really means it doesn't agree with my opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So, the first one that I think is the most evidence for this, if anything, and some of you might know the word psi, PSI, which is kind of the lingo within the field. It's what we call, maybe more in colloquial language, like clairvoyance. And they usually they distinguish two different kinds of psi. Receptive psi, maybe that's not the right word, receptive psi and active psi. So receptive would be to know a phenomena, know about information that you could not obtain through ordinary means. And active psi would be like psychokinesis, where you're able to actually manipulate things at a distance. And these both have both anecdotal evidence and a lot of experimental evidence, in the sense of making predictions. Can we, if psi is, if it's true that people are, that, for example, some people might have very strong ability, more than normal, but maybe it's just a natural capacity. Then if we test many people with double-blind studies, then we should get results showing that ordinary people guess more than chance. And this has been done many times. So there's actually a lot of evidence for this. And as I said, the argument against it usually is try to prove that it's fraudulent, or that there's some fault in the experiment. in the methodology. But oftentimes I think because there's such a strong bias against it, any small fault is taken as proof that it's therefore fraudulent or faulty methodology. But from what I've read, it seems like it passes a lot more standards of good science than a lot of things that are considered good science. Like there's an example that was given. Some of you might know was V.S. Ramachandran, he's another materialist scientist. He tried to just kind of show the credulousness of the scientific community. He wrote a fake article that was peer reviewed, trying to show why is it that men prefer blondes, and he kind of provided the evolutionary reasons why men are more attracted to blonde women. And he made up all these things, and it was very well reviewed. So, the point being that, yeah, right. So that kind of thing, is able to pass. But then, of course, the studies that indicate psi are often, attacked, and people who do the studies are attacked and lose credibility in their field. So it actually takes a lot of courage and basically dedication, because you're willing to sacrifice your career to get into these things. But if you're interested, I think the best book I've read on this phenomenon is Extraordinary Knowing by Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer. So it's interesting. Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, just her story briefly, she was a psychoanalyst actually, and her daughter was a young girl, played the harp, and then the harp, she lived in San Francisco, was stolen, and so Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer at that point had no interest in psi. She didn't know anything about it, and out of desperation, somebody suggested she call what's called a dowser, which is somebody, in this case, somebody who can locate objects in a distance with psi. And this person, I think, was like in Arkansas. She was in San Francisco. And the person gave her coordinates to go to this particular address. And she went and found the harp. It had been a homeless man had apparently, sold it to this guy in an instrument shop, who then when he heard what happened, he just gave it back to her and said, "Get it back to your daughter." So based on that, then she made it kind of her new career to research this and to try to find out more. She was amazed by some of the evidence she discovered. So she then published this book, actually just before she died. Suddenly she had some kind of very rare illness quite suddenly. So just as I mentioned about these things about fraudulence, I looked up on the internet after I'd read the book just to see kind of what people would say about her. And there was, of course, our websites trying to debunk her. And two of the points they made trying to debunk her. One was, so one of the people she worked with, or at least talked with a lot, was Dean Radin, who's a very famous psi researcher, probably the most prominent in the world right now. And this is the actual wording of this article. It said, not only does Mrs. Mayer believe in psi herself, not only does Elizabeth Mayer believe in non-existent woo-boo, she associates with Dean Radin, a known woo believer. And then it went on to say, well, look, she died right after she wrote the book. She must have been wistfully thinking that mind was not the brain, that she would continue to live, and must have panicked about her own death. So again, that is conceivably true, but to take that as this therefore proves, this is not scientific view at all. Let's just say that I can kind of, we say, armchair psychology, and psychoanalyze my opponent and say that his view just comes from this kind of wrong psycho idea.
Well, Amazon does better.
Yeah.
In their review,
Okay.
Extraordinary Knowing says it is an attempt to break through the silence imposed by fear and to explore what science has to say about these and countless other inexplicable phenomena. And it says that she reveals a wealth of credible and fascinating research into the realm where the mind seems to trump the laws of nature.
Yeah.
She does not ask us to believe, she's just
Yeah,
presenting the information.
that's one thing I would say, is that regardless of her own cycle state, I don't know, she's just presenting information that was already there. And
Yeah,
it's a very good book if you'd like to just be aware of some of the things that have been found over the past 100 years.
okay with that.
There you go. And
So the inverse, which Davidson, where until this was, but hey, you know, I follow this.
Yeah.
Talking about that, like, the DSM said, is there anything positive in here? You know, just like, so it was like, why?
Yeah.
Those negative things, what about the positive things? And then people were like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah,
But then it led credibility to him, like,
Mm.
hey, man, it's only not allowing to
Yeah.
with this, and it was, oh, well, okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
But a lot of that stuff is woo-woo, you know, like, it's unexplainable. I remember the one story about Matthew Ricard, they were like, dude, this is on the chart, so you can't even measure this. And they're like, what are you doing this? Oh, I'm just doing meta practice or micro
Yeah.
practice. And it's not doing that.
Yeah.
And it's messing up on it. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, whether or not this evidence proves non-materialist mind, it is certainly, in any case, evidence, and it's something that should be available to people. So the approach of trying to silence them and discredit the people is not a scientific approach at all. Yeah, it should be, if it's really wrong, it will disprove itself, and we should encourage more people to read about it so that they can then find the flaws in it. But the argument that's sometimes made is that this is deceiving people, and that we need to, like Richard Dawkins, some of you might know, very outspoken against any kind of work like this, and often will verbally attack people who do these kind of studies, is that people already have so many wrong ideas, and you're just putting more wrong ideas out there, and we're trying to rein in the wrong ideas, sort of like religious fundamentalism, and you're just spouting out all these things. And we should silence religious fundamentalists, because all they do is breed more religious fundamentalists. Yeah. What's that?
So in paperback, it is $17, and if you order it right now, you can get it tomorrow.
Okay, so yeah, that was the first one was psi, PSI. The second phenomena that I think I mentioned earlier is near-death experience, which I kind of grade these in terms of how challenging they are. There are people who accept psi and are still materialists, because theoretically it could be explicable by material means. Radio waves are perfectly explicable in a materialist framework, but they transmit information over a long distance. Near-death experience is a little harder. People who who seem to have no brain activity, but then report conscious activity. And so early on, there were a number of studies into this that were interesting, but not very rigorous, in that they were mainly just kind of people reporting their experience many years later, which doesn't have a lot of credibility in science. But there's been more recent studies that have tried to, like the best one that I know of, at least, this was 15 years ago, I think it was published, so maybe there's better ones now, but was Pim van Lommel, Dutch scientist, Lommel, Pim, P-I-M, van Lommel. It's called Consciousness Beyond Life, name of his book. So in his hospital in Holland, he's a cardiologist. For many years, he interviewed every single person who was brought back from cardiac arrest, basically, and asked them if they could. He didn't necessarily give every interview, but he had his staff conduct these interviews in a very systematic way. Asked them if they could report anything that happened, any experience they had. So therefore, it wasn't just people reporting back, and it wasn't only asking the people who had the experience. It was asking everybody and trying to get data and being able to analyze the data.
had they made it to the Bardo? I mean, is this-
Well, yeah, so what he found was that I think about 20% of cases, people did report things, and some of them were very interesting in and of themselves. And he reports a lot of the evidence, a lot of the reports that people give. What's even more interesting is what is the follow-up and analyzing data over many years. So, for example, of the people who had, the 20% of people who had what he calls strong near-death experience, then almost every case, they lost fear of death and they became more spiritual people, which is not something you just fake, right? Whereas in the cases of people who did not have near-death experience, they usually became more afraid of death. And other things that not just interviewing them, interviewing their family, they usually became more compassionate, according to other people's reports. And what he says, although again, he says it's not particularly a scientific data in and of itself, but it's something to take very seriously. All of them said this was the most important experience of my life. So to then say they're all just frauds is completely out of the realm of the good science. When people are very sincerely saying this is the most important thing that ever happened to me, and you say you're just a liar, it doesn't. It kind of makes science into a tool. Science is supposed to be a tool for examining, trying to gain more understanding of phenomena that happen, rather than simply just denying things that don't work for us. But anyway, of course, the point is that if this is really happening when people are in cardiac arrest and there's no brain activity, it's a very strong challenge to there being, to the mind being purely dependent upon the brain. So that would be the next step is near-death experience. Then another one that I mentioned before and that I've had some involvement in, not that I experienced it, but we see this in our monastery, is tukdam, which is when somebody is in meditation at the time of death, and then the body stays fresh for a significant period of time afterwards. So this happens both in Buddhism and also it seems to be fairly commonly reported in other religions like Hinduism. And I'm interested, if anybody knows more about this, what I'll tell right now, I'd like to know, because I don't know a lot about the story behind it. But there, in Hinduism, there was the famous teacher Yogananda. You might have seen that book, The Autobiography of a Yogi. So when he died in 1952 in Los Angeles, his body stayed fresh for about 25 days. And the mortician, this is how I know about it, he published a letter saying, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I examined it very closely for all this time. I have no way to explain what happened. This is published in that book, The Autobiography of Yogi. So then again, with this accusation of fraud, I looked this up on the internet to see what people say about it, and the analysis by this materialist scientist was, well, what happened was that they injected his body with some kind of let me say formaldehyde or something that preserves the body. Okay, but do you have any way to prove that happened? He says, well, because, and his thing is, well, because there was a 2-hour period after he died when nobody saw him but his students. Okay, well, it's conceivable that he's right, but to therefore assume that must be what happened. And the argument is basically, this is so far out of the realm of the ordinary science, it's much more likely that they injected him with that than that something else happened that overturns the scientific paradigm. Right? So maybe so.
Isn't there a Buddhist tradition around death that when a person dies, friends and family gather in the room and they all meditate for 3 days? I mean, each person doesn't sit there for 3 days, but rotate. I read
Yes,
that was
yes.
a Buddhist tradition. We did it for my She's not exactly my sister-in-law, but I really think it was too
Mhm.
complicated. So I thought, you know, when I did my, my will and, all the, things that you're supposed to do, to
Mhm.
say what you want at death.
Mhm.
So I thought, what the hell?
Mhm.
I put that in. My family is all Buddhist, my children, my,
Mhm.
you know, so I thought, I put it in just in case.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's also something that, you know, it's, I mean, not just in Buddhist culture, but a lot of other cultures have a tradition of there's something sacred about death. That, you know, it's just you don't just take a body and throw it in an incinerator. Like, you know, basically like a piece of garbage. And maybe we'd learn a lot if we allowed that to happen more, because generally in our culture, we just, as soon as the body's dead, you want to cover it up and get rid of it. So that what maybe there's something worth studying there. Tukdam, the Tibetans consider that Tukdam is not like, as you say, ordinary people, their consciousness stays in the body for some time. It's just a matter of the person, because they have more control, they can extend that period. Right.
They lie meditating.
Yes. So yeah, there's been many cases of this that I've observed at the monastery. And now there's been some research into it. And just recently, there was a movie released about it, which is fortunate. So if you're interested, you can see Tukdam.
How do you spell that?
So in the movie they spelled it Tukdam. Usually they have an H, but they didn't add that. So, Tukdam, between worlds. Yeah.
And your Vedanta story, I mean, and, you know, that book is literally all kinds of miracles.
Yeah, that's the thing.
So it's kind of.
It's sort of-
unbelievable, but
yeah.
He even talked about his guru.
Mhm.
Predicting his own death, and that was the thing about, you know, even if you have some scientists saying, well, there was 2 hours, and it was relevant.
Yeah.
Well, how do you explain the 2 weeks before that, where he's saying, I'm gonna have a heart attack, it's thing.
Yeah,
He didn't know it's a heart attack, I'm gonna
Yeah.
pass away, how was the.
Yeah.
That you were talking about, like,
Yeah.
I'm lucid, and hey, I'm gonna be leaving, and I'm just.
Yeah.
Let's see, let the divine be,
Yeah.
and is that proof that there is some kind of, you know, line stream or continuum, or do we need proof that, you know, like, His Holiness comes back and, oh, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine.
Well, that's the next thing I was going to get to, right? So with the Tukdam, yeah, I mean, it certainly is strong a challenge to the materialist paradigm, but you know, it's not quite the same as proving reincarnation, which is another step. So that would be the fourth thing. I mentioned that there were 4 things that I think are the most strong pieces of evidence, and there's 2 others that I think are kind of minor but useful. One is terminal lucidity that I mentioned before, but the fourth one would be reincarnation. And I think especially the works of Ian Stevenson, some of you might know. There's many studies into reincarnation from different angles, but none of them compare with his in terms of scientific rigor and the use of the scientific method. Because a lot of studies of reincarnation are, for example, people who are in hypnosis and recollect past lives, which I think if you're interested is worth reading because it's a lot of interesting points, but certainly to a skeptic, it's not going to prove anything, especially if you can't actually, you know, research and find, does that person actually ever exist? I could say, well, I was a knight in the Middle Ages. Okay. You know, but if I could say, well, I was a knight in the Middle Ages and I lived in this place and my body was buried here and this was buried in my body, you find it, that's something very different. But with Stevenson, he dedicated his whole life to this. You know, so Ian Stevenson was the chair of the Department of Psychiatry at University of Virginia in the 1950s. But he had some leanings towards psi phenomena, I think, from his family. And so he wanted to do this research. And as I understand it, although he couldn't get funding from the university, I think the founder of the Xerox Corporation funded him to do this research the rest of his life, something like that.
Well, if we could just get your dog to talk. And talk about his former life as a hen.
So from about 1957 to 2007 when he died, so 50 years, Stevenson traveled around the world, different cultures that reported reincarnation. And his usual method was he would go to a town and see if there were any children who reported recollection of past lives. And then go to those children and do very detailed interviews with them, then try to research it. So he would find out, especially the best is if they could identify who they were. And then he could be present when he first introduced them to their former family and make very detailed notes about how they reacted and what happened. And did they make correct identifications? So I think he gathered about 3,000 cases, some of which are stronger than others. And he's very honest. He was a scientist. He was, as I say, he was a chair of the Department of Psychiatry there, and he knew how to use the scientific method. And he was very honest about which cases are stronger and for what reasons and what are alternate explanations. He goes to all of those. The strongest cases are the ones that involve birthmarks. He considers these the strongest, so he made an entire separate volume, actually 2-volume set, which is kind of his masterwork. I think of all of his books, this is, if you're really interested, it'll take you a long time to read, but Reincarnation and Biology, 2 volumes, about 2,000 pages total, where there are, I don't remember, it's 900 something cases of children who recollected a past life and then had a particular birthmark or birth defect corresponding usually to the mode of death of that person in that life. And in many cases was then verifiable through medical records or some other means of that previous life. So there are many cases, but I think one of the ones that's most interesting has strengths and weaknesses, but the strengths are very, very strong. Was this child in Turkey? I forget the name. I used to know the name. So this child was born basically with the entire right side of his face was kind of deformed, and the ear was almost nothing. It was just like a little stump. And from a early age, basically from the time he was able to talk, he started talking about the man who shot him in the side of the head and identifying him by name. And then asked to be taken to the next village and started throwing rocks at this guy's store and saying, "Why did you kill me?" And also one aspect of the story was the mother. This could be taken as if you want to argue against it. So it's useful to look at very carefully, like you're examining a murder mystery. The mother, but when she was pregnant, she had a dream of the man who was murdered. Because there had been this man that was murdered, who came to her in a dream with blood streaming down the side of his face. And she said, "Get away from me." He said, "No, I'm coming. I'm going to stay with you." Right. But okay, so what if she then convinced the child he was the reincarnation of this person, right? It's possible, but who would want to convince their child, go to the next town and throw rocks at this guy's store and tell him he murdered you? Yeah. So what had happened in this case is that there had been this man sleeping in the field because he was a farmer. He just one day he just took a nap in his field. And they got another man who knew him, and it seemed maybe had a grudge against him, came along and shot him in the side of the head, and then ran away. When the police later caught him, he claimed, "I thought it was a rabbit. I thought I was shooting a rabbit because it was a bit misty. And why did you run away?" "Well, because I thought his sons were going to come get me," which was a reasonable, probably would have been true. So he was they convicted him of, I think, not of murder, but of fleeing a crime scene. And he got 2 years in prison and was released. But he continued to insist that I didn't murder you. And over the years, the boy finally agreed to him. He believed him. He said, I accept. Actually, I realized that was an accident. I thought you intentionally tried to kill me, but now I see it was an accident. He kind of, over the years, came to accept it. And there were other things, like Stevens had examined the sides of the head, and there were little marks, like shotgun pellets, which he had been shot with a shotgun. So it wasn't just that there was something missing, but the birthmark corresponded to the way that it might look. Somebody was shot that way.
Conditions create the same. Why?
Yeah.
Such a strong expression. What we think about it in terms of like, honestly, being reborn, being the brain enlightenment, they always come back to this body, Like this holiness, like, oh, people,
Yeah.
right things in China.
Yeah.
Would that be the genius?
I think, yeah, I mean, it's a good question, because if we want to take, if a very simple view of karma, well, if I do something bad, I'm supposed to have bad results. So someone does something bad to me, why should I have bad results, right? But I think that's a very simplistic view of it, that, yeah, as he's saying, that the mind, it's making an imprint and the person is holding very strongly to that. It's like trauma, right? So, okay, when somebody abused me as a child, why do I have why do I have the traumatic memories as an adult? He did the bad thing. Well, yeah, that's true, but it's the way the mind holds the things. And we could say, well, at a deeper level, I created the karma to be abused, and that's continuing to affect me when I have the memory. In the same way, I created the karma to be shot, and that karma is continuing to ripen in the next life as deformity or whatever else, right?
And I'm thinking about the complexity of karma, which I was thinking about before earlier in our conversation.
Yeah.
All the different, I mean, the large view that only an omniscient mind can really perceive. What conditions, I mean, I hear you in terms of the magnification of the imprint right before death and the impact it could have. But then there are all the other conditions for multiple lives that would also influence.
Yeah.
That's the part that I'm thinking
Yeah.
of. It just seems.
What if that kid was like, just.
Yeah.
Was it just the complication coming together that is good?
Yeah.
And then other people, okay, John Trump,
Yeah.
being born Japanese scientist.
Yeah, I mean, Stevenson does an excellent job. Again, this book, if you can't read Reincarnation in Biology, if you don't have time to read a 2,000-page book or afford it, unfortunately, I think it's kind of expensive. I don't think there's an e-version or anything. Another book first of all, there's Where Biology and Reincarnation and Biology Intersect, which is Stevenson's own condensation of that same book. So if you just want to read some of the better parts. And there's also another book that came out a couple of years ago called Rebirth in Early Buddhism and Current Research, I think, by Bhikkhu Analayo. So he's, a Buddhist monk, very well-known writer now, who presented a lot of evidence, both Stevenson's and others, and kind of gives a good survey of the field. So that might be a good place to start. But anyway, in Reincarnation and Biology, he devotes a lot of time just to going through the case studies, but he devotes a lot of time to kind of analysis, as you would do in a good scientific paper. What do we make of all this? So as you're asking, and he tries to kind of put together the cases and say he's not trying to defend any particular hypothesis. He's just saying, well, it would seem that this is a pattern that we're observing. And to see what could that suggest? And he comes up with ideas. Well, could there be some kind of energetic body that's carrying imprints? And does that fit with the evidence? Or could there be this possibility? So I personally like that approach. I think I try to make it clear that with Buddhism, I don't take it as we have, this is dogma that we have to defend. That the Buddhist paradigm is a very useful one. But with any kind of presentation like this, we don't want to just be, it's just the same as a materialist saying it's fraudulent. We don't want to just reject the ones that don't fit into what, our current picture of things. The way reincarnation functions, if it does happen at all, might be a lot different than the way we currently conceive of it. So it's not just a matter of, I believe in reincarnation or not. What is really happening? And this gets into the question of what is mind and how does it relate to the body?
Is this like the cracking, letting a little light in with these arguments presenting? Is that, I don't know what your intention or motivation is, but for like a little, if you open up just a little to that, and you have a little more confidence in the view, and the confidence of enlightenment, which will help you have confidence in Bodhicitta.
Yes. Well, that's certainly part of it, as I said. Bringing in Dharmakirti's arguments that Dharmakirti basically says if you don't believe in reincarnation, then forget about enlightenment. So certainly, and if we want to talk about reincarnation, I feel it's almost dishonest to give an argument for reincarnation that doesn't talk about Stevenson's research, because that's by far the best research we have today. So why just try to use the traditional Buddhist argument when there's this out there? I think the reason I think maybe I brought it up in the morning too. I don't think you were here, but was just this main the focus of these talks was on the two truths, and I was trying to say that the two truths is a way of structuring reality, trying to understand how things function. And some of us in the modern world might have the assumption that that's irrelevant now, that we already kind of, I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't, maybe, you're here, you're open to it, but there are many people who, just think science has already pretty much explained everything. There was Lord Kelvin, some of you might know, the famous physicist, just before the quantum revolution and also Einstein's theories, who basically made the statement, we've pretty much figured out everything. It's just a few little matter of filling in the dots now. And within a few years, the whole paradigm was overturned. But a lot of people still have this view that there's no real use in more intellectual speculation of philosophy. It's just a matter of applying science to more problems and gaining more data. There's a question of whether the current paradigm of materialism is able to explain what's happening and explain everything, give a coherent picture of things. So I think, for one thing, this is why I bring in the evidence, because this is a lot of things that are not explicable. But I think that's a poor theory if we want to explain these things. And the only way to respond to it is to try to discredit it. Whereas there might be a different way, which requires moving back a long way. Science has grown out of a materialist paradigm, although originally the scientists were not materialists. They were kind of in that direction. Like Descartes, I mentioned at the beginning, it was almost like he wanted to say, there's the mental world, that exists, but let's just not think about it and examine the physical world, which has nothing to do with the mental world. So if you do that long enough, you start thinking, well, why do we even need to have a mental world? We've got the physical world and we can explain that, and the mental world has no bearing on that. So why not just throw it out? But maybe we need to rethink all of that. So
Don't Buddhists also talk about this as absolute and relative reality? I'm just remembering from all the programs and retreats I've been to, that it's relative and absolute.
Yes, I mean, I think probably it's just absolute is probably just a different translation of ultimate truth. So my feeling is that, personally, in ancient India, there were a lot of very different pictures of the way things exist that are quite different from materialism or anything that was going on in Western thought. And I don't think they necessarily explain everything. There's a lot more evidence that's available today. But at the same time, they are definitely worth thinking about as we try to make a more coherent picture of things. And so as Buddhist practitioners, if we think about emptiness and the two truths, this is why I think it's important. When we meditate on emptiness, it shouldn't be that it's not just about, okay, well, it says this in the Lamrim Chenmo, and therefore I just do that meditation and follow exactly the instructions. I mean, really what it's supposed to be about is examining how things exist. So if it has no bearing, on one level, we live our lives in a materialist framework and we think about things that way, and then we meditate on what it says in the Lamrim Chenmo. It doesn't have much relation. But if you can really challenge, first of all, recognize what kind of viewpoint you might hold, and then try to challenge that with different ways of thinking, and to bring, it requires a good understanding, certainly, of what it does say in the traditional text. We don't want to just misinterpret them. But we have to really, this is what we do in debate, is dig into them very deeply, not just take it out. He said that, okay, now I understand it. Is really ask a question, try to get into the mind of the person speaking this, and what framework, what background was he coming from that caused him to have these ideas. Then you have to go very deeply into it. Personally, as I said, I found it quite worthwhile to do so for many years. It's definitely changed the way I think about things. And as I said, I'll Whether it's the right way or not, I'll have to let you know. No, more than 3 more years than that, yeah. Hold on. Okay.
This, rather intense pursuit of, and, truth behind the Dharma, and today strikes me as being much more typical of the Buddha, and which is where the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm, mhm,
it's the lineage that I studied this.
mhm.
And there is a, I mean, there's still the adage, don't believe anything that you're told.
Yeah, I know.
Don't believe your teacher, but
Mhm.
challenge it, study it, and make your own decisions.
Yeah.
But what the monastery that you're in that really emphasizes such deep study and faith,
Mhm.
it takes it to a deeper level.
Well, they're different approaches. Yeah, it's like we have just down the street from us, Sarah, this Namdling Monastery, which is the biggest Nyingma monastery in India. And yeah, they have a very different approach. Now, they didn't do debate traditionally. Now they do. They do it 1 hour a day, whereas we do it like 6 hours a day. But they have it, right? Whereas what they have that we don't have is they do a lot more meditation than we do. It's a structured part of their program. They do preliminary practices and physical yoga and Dzogchen meditation as part of their lifestyle there. So yeah, there are different ways of approaching it. And I can't, that's why I say I'm still agnostic about it. I can't say this is a better approach. I'm not willing to say that the Gelug scholars are therefore more wise than the Nyingma. I wouldn't say that at all. But whether one is better than the other, or one is better for different people, I have to, before I can say that for sure, I really have to know a lot about both of them. But I do think I can say, in and of itself, I found debate very, very helpful. Much more than I expected. And I see the value of it, and I see that I would have been impoverished without it, that early on. Although I was very sincere and had a lot of faith that was probably not going to get easily shaken, because I was, I had a lot of heart connection with Buddhism. I think I had a lot of naive ideas, and I didn't question them enough. And it's really forced me to come to terms with that. And it's given me tools for doing that. And for also, what said, one of the main advantages of studying so much is that you're much more effective in explaining things to others. So it has to come, they say, it has to come from compassion. You have to not just want to understand this yourself, but want to be able to use it as an effective tool to help others.
That's part of the Bodhisattva idea.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I just want to make note, we need to be
Oh, yeah.
cleaned up and gone by 5, so.
Okay,
this is 20
okay.
Minutes, whatever
Yeah,
that
okay.
means for what.
Well, I think, yeah, as I said, I've pretty much finished with what I was saying, although I know I had these other things to read, but I'm not gonna have time today. I mean, we mentioned about if people had an interest tomorrow. Do you want to say anything about that, or should I? Say something?
Yeah, if people are interested in, Gache has offered, since his flight has been delayed, he'll be here tomorrow. I think many of you have other plans, but I'm happy to open my home for a few hours to continue the teachings and conversation. So if that's useful.
Where would that be?
I just live down in Littleton, so it's just 10 minutes from here.
In Littleton, so are you,
So I'm
south of here?
I'm south and west, so it's essentially like Santa Fe and Bolt.
Oh,
No, animals.
okay.
Where are you?
I'm at Windcrest, so that would be, Santa Fe, the closest street would be Santa Fe and County Line, Plaza Drive.
Okay, so that's not so far. So
No, that's
I
very,
could come.
that's very close. No, I'll just, I don't know what time.
Okay.
The thing is that my husband's going to, that he needs the car for, but why don't we
Exchange
exchange
numbers and you can be in
Okay.
communication.
Yeah.
And I think Justin's going to send out another email to folks
Okay,
in the phone was really nice, but won't ask you to
Yeah.
do that again tomorrow.
Yeah, you guys do it on Zoom.
Yeah, let's see if we can do.
Oh, right, if you do it on Zoom, then I don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I don't, well, we'll see. We'll see.
Better luck, he's better luck. Zoom and nothing.
Right. I'm not sure, I know that we'll record it to share later. I don't know, well, actually, the Zoom teaching. So, but Justin has your information, I'm sure, yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's the question briefly then, for those of you who would be interested tomorrow is, there's a few options. One is I could go through some of the things I didn't get to today, but those other texts. One would be to have more like question and answer, and one would be to have a totally different subject. It's perfectly fine that people have something else in Buddhism that they are curious about.
So many things.
Right. Yeah.
So many things that I'm curious about, that I have devoted years of intense study to.
Well, I'm basically, if you just ask me tomorrow, it's probably okay. I don't think, unless you wanted like a full-scale presentation like I did today, which we don't need, but we could have more kind of an informal thing. Right. Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Well, we'll exchange numbers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Will you post in-
Yeah, we can do. You wanna lead or she? Oh, okay. Just these two verses. May the precious supreme Bodhicitta not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline but increase more and more. May the precious view of emptiness not yet born arise. May that arisen not decline but increase more and more.
And on behalf of Lama Yeshe House and First Universalist, this has just been tremendous. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing.
Yeah. I hope you'll come back
Yeah, that's
all the way from India.
it's gonna be a
just
few
for
years
us.
before I'm
Yeah.
back again.
Okay, well, we'll be
See-
here.
See what happens.
At your monastery in India, you have internet, maybe you can do all kinds of
Yeah,
research.
for better or worse, we could say. Yeah.
So you're on Google to do research and look things up and.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I do. I'm very careful how I use it because it can easily become a distraction. And our schedule is very intense. But we do have it now and it's almost, it's unavoidable. You know, like everywhere in the world, all the monastery announcements now come through WhatsApp, so we have to tune into that, yeah.
Wow.
It's funny because not too many years ago, you weren't allowed to use it. And there was a joke that they were gonna send out the message on the WhatsApp, you can't use WhatsApp.
Well, you're doing such intense research and you've read so many books. I mean, does Amazon deliver to you?
We have, they do actually, we have Amazon India. And as Heather knows, I mean, I have 75 pounds of books now that I'm carrying back because very kindly, a couple of the American publishers give us a lot of the books. We have a library in our house there. So we get the book, some of them for free, some of them for a reduced price. Amazon books, we don't get a reduced price, but I try to find what's available, if you get used books, things like that. And we've got a very extensive library now, as you probably guessed from what I'm talking about. We've got a lot of Buddhist books, but then a lot of science and history, comparative religion, and all of these books on different psi phenomena that I've talked about. We have a bit, quite a lot devoted to that. It's super useful for us. Sarah, SERA.
Are you reading books? I mean, I imagine you would see